This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, my friend. Each year, the Sunday after Pentecost, we have the theologically inspired anniversary of Trinity Sunday. The Father has sent the Son. We've followed the Son through the story of birth and then life and crucifixion, death, resurrection and ascension. And then at Pentecost, the Spirit also arrives, and it begs the question, doesn't it? What are these three persons and how does that work as God? It's like the liturgists who organised the liturgical calendar allowed a theologian to insist the annual worship timetable acknowledge this difficult yet important notion of Trinity. And I'm glad they did. Trinity is such a difficult concept, I think I would avoid it if it was left to me. But it's so important, I'm glad it's inserted into our annual cycle of Sundays. And there are many ways we could seek to make sense of Trinity. And one is the way in which we encounter truth, I think. See, some truth is given to us. It's part of the world of assumptions into which we are born. In most families, for example, there's no need to teach a child who is their mother or who is their father or who are their siblings. Those relationships are just given, they are assumed, and while from time to time there may be cause to pause and a need to remind various members of the family who is who, because sometimes we behave contrary to our roles, in reality we know, don't we? Those things are kind of uncontested. And this is like the truth that God the Father reveals to us. It is apparent in our world. We have no need to be taught it, and even though we may act contrary to it from time to time, nevertheless we know it to be true. This is the truth that holds us in reality. It is the set of shared understandings that appear incontestable. And even in our increasingly mixed up world where people believe the most abject nonsense and the set of shared assumptions seems to be shrinking, there remain things that we hold in common to be true. And I think that's a bit like God the Father who holds us in this larger assumed truth. But there's also truth that is not so intuitively apparent to us. In fact, some truth is quite counter to our intuition. I remember when my girls were toddlers and watching children playing together, and they would compete for toys. And I watched parents' intuition, and their intuition was always to urge the child to share the toys with each other so that they could play nicely together. And the reality is, a toddler cannot learn to share until the toddler has learnt to own. Because otherwise, it's really just stuff being taken away from one child and being given to someone else. The child has no agency in that process. Until they are aware they can possess a thing, then they have no power to offer it to somebody else. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a bit counter to my intuition. Until it's explained to me and I'm shown the truth of it, and I kind of go, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. I think this is like the truth that Jesus, the Son, reveals to us. Our intuition is not necessarily going to point us in the right direction every time. We need someone to show us and to make it plain to us. So, like when Jesus said things like, those who seek to save their own life will lose it. And this goes against the more common perception that no one gives us anything. We have to secure stuff for ourselves. And yet any person who spends their days seeking merely to secure stuff for themselves becomes the loneliest of all people. They fear others are after their stuff, so they hoard it. They use their wealth and power or position as relational currency to get what they want from others, and as a consequence become limited to merely transactional ways of being. They never allow themselves to discover what it means to be loved simply for who they are. And they have lost their life well before they have found it. Jesus not only taught this counterintuitive truth, he lived it out before his disciples and before us in the pages of the gospel, all the way to his death on the cross and beyond to his ascension, his resurrection and ascension. But life and circumstances continue to develop, don't they? Jesus could not show us every truth related to our every circumstance. For example, have you noticed Jesus says nothing about Facebook? Jesus does not directly address how we should use nuclear technologies. He's virtually silent about global warming and climate change. These are the places in which we need God, the Holy Spirit, to guide us into all truth. The Spirit is consistent with Jesus. I don't know if you're familiar with Charles Sheldon's religious bestseller of about 100 years ago, In His Steps. It was a book he wrote, and he coined the phrase, "What would Jesus do?" This is the question that the Holy Spirit answers for us and guides us into today. The Holy Spirit is the same Spirit who guided and empowered Jesus. This is the Spirit of God, pre-existing creation, so there before creation, at work to bring about creation and continuing to be at work within creation. These three persons of the Trinity. And you might say, well, which one is in charge? Because we like to know who's in charge, don't we? And when it comes to who's in charge, who's running the show, we quite often look for a hierarchy. We want to know who's at the top. We naturally think in those terms, and often God the Father is imagined to be the boss. He's the head of the family thing, so. And after all, don't fathers call the shots for their sons and daughters, usually? At least when the sons and daughters are younger. But as many of us know, sons and daughters often call the shots for fathers and mothers as they get older. Many of us are very aware of that at the moment, which is actually a way of describing that the most suitable or capable or appropriate person calls the shots depending on the circumstances. Yet with the Godhead, it's not a committee of three, tussling over who has jurisdiction over this particular area or that specific matter. Rather, there is a single purpose being expressed by three distinct persons, not so much a hive mind where each contributes parts of it for a greater whole, but a quality of absolute truth that finds a variety of expressions according to what is required at the time. And this process of divine self-disclosure is really helpful, I think. It's a very gracious and generous process. As we look at, for example, the process of revelation through the history of the Scriptures, it shows us too. We move from what is a commonly held assumption, and then there's often a challenge to a key aspect of assumed wisdom and truth at a strategic moment. For example, when Abraham, who shared the assumption of his day that in a crisis you offer a sacrifice, an important sacrifice, a human sacrifice. And he is told by God that if he's going to offer a human sacrifice, it should be his own son. So he takes his own son, Isaac, off as a sacrifice. And everyone in Abraham's world understood how sacrifice worked. There was a shared assumption there. There was no need, if there was a need to satisfy the demands of an angry deity or to secure their support in some kind of way, you had to offer a life. The more precious the life, the more valuable and effective the sacrifice. Yet at the key moment, God instructs Abraham not to offer his son Isaac. Rather, a goat is offered in Isaac's place. You might say, well, that makes a bit of a mockery, doesn't it? And at that point, the tribes of Abraham become the singular culture of the time that ruled out human sacrifice altogether. Now, in due course, the revelation of God would also make it clear that blood sacrifice was not what God required or even desired. Hundreds of years before the birth of Jesus, the 8th century prophets decried the people's use of blood sacrifice as a mechanism to excuse their corrupt lifestyles. But it simply was not possible to jump from the original assumption in the day of Abraham to the 8th century BC understanding that the prophets started to introduce. It just wouldn't have worked. It was an unmanageable shift, so they did it in manageable steps. And in a similar way, we move from an awareness of God the Father to the arrival of the Son. Now, the Son's bona fides are based on the fact that he is the Son of the Father. People were not expecting the Son. They were expecting a Messiah, but not really the Son, and certainly not a Messiah who was like Jesus turned out to be. Jesus is ultimately accepted as Messiah only because it became clear he was the Son of God. And it is Jesus who introduces to the people the notion of the Holy Spirit being spread abroad. The Holy Spirit was known, of course, before Jesus, but only visited people in rare situations and very specific people. Prophets, the odd king here and there, they knew about the Holy Spirit. Jesus introduces his followers to the notion that the Holy Spirit would come to all of them. The Spirit would take up the role as guide after Jesus ascended. Now, unlike Jesus, who showed the disciples by example how to live and what the truth was and so forth, the Spirit works within the disciple, transforming the heart, shifting motives, changing desires. And the things that the Spirit and the Son do and share are the Father's affairs and interests. The Son does what he sees the Father doing. The Spirit points us to the Son. These are three persons working not for their own ends, not according to their own purposes. And I've struggled to think of an analogy for this, and I think it's a little bit akin to the First Nations people's understanding of their relationship to land, in a way. Land is so much bigger than the people. It's not possible for the land to belong to the First Nations people. It's more accurate to say that the First Nations people belong to the land. The identity and activity of each of the three persons of the Trinity does not belong to each of the persons. The persons belong to their identity and activity as God, as expressions of the larger notion of the Godhead. Now, I can't explain it better than that to you. It's too bloody complicated. But it's big. It's bigger than we can understand. Now, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit are three persons working together, not in competition with each other. There's no hint of insecurity here, no suggestion that one is more important than the other. They are not found attempting to spin a story that makes themselves look good, constantly referring to the other, continually deferring in humility and respect. There's a hymn in the letter that Paul writes to the Philippians, and it indicates that Jesus did not consider equality with the Father something he needed to grasp. The Son knows he is the Son. The Son is neither seeking to outdo nor to become the Father. This is not a relationship that we commonly, not a a dynamic we commonly observe in relationships, because in so many families, due to the relational dynamic in the home life, children develop deep-seated insecurities and drives to prove themselves to their parents. And it's almost as though there remains an aching need, a vacuum inside the child sometimes, that not even the most extreme success will ever satisfy. But there's no hint of that kind of dis-ease in the Godhead. They are secure together. They're working for one purpose, honouring each other. And maybe the most profound insight I found as I reflected on Trinity this year is there's no such thing as a person alone. The reality is that not even in God can there be a person alone. It's literally impossible to be an individual. I know that's a politically incorrect thing to say, but individual is a confected idea, like a unicorn, for example. An individual cannot procreate. So it's biologically impossible. An individual does not have the resources required to survive the hostilities of life. We need one another for survival. And just as importantly, an individual has no way of knowing who they are on their own, because we can only become persons in relationship with other persons. I don't know if you ever saw the 90s, 80s movie, Jerry Maguire. There's a scene towards the end where Jerry Maguire confesses to his estranged wife, "You complete me." And that's a truth. There simply is no me without you. And there's no you without the other people around you, and vice versa. That's not to say that each person in the Godhead is not distinct and unique, because they most certainly are. Yet their distinct uniqueness is working together as part of something which is at the same time who they are and also larger than merely who they are as a person. Try this one. I'm grasping here, but when I stand at the lectern at the Anzac morning service down in Union Square, I am, of course, the Reverend David Gore. But many who attend that service don't know that name. They don't know me. They know me as the minister from Mustard Seed. Now, that's an entirely accurate appreciation of who I am. I represent the mustard seed. I would not be there but for the fact that I am the minister of Mustard Seed. And even the event itself would not take place except for the efforts of the team of people who are Mustard Seed. The network of relationships that are the Mustard Seed provide the context of meaning for who I am and what I am doing in that situation. I am both David Gore, but more importantly, in a way, I'm the minister from Mustard Seed. The Father is the Father because of the relationship with the Son and the Holy Spirit. The Son is the Son by virtue of the relationship that exists with the Father and the Spirit. And the Holy Spirit is the Holy Spirit because He is the Spirit of the Father and the Son. All three are crucial. None make sense except for their relationship with the other two. This is how every person is known. This is how we know ourselves. We see ourselves in the eyes of those who reflect what they see in us back to us. Context and relationship provide the constituent parts of meaning and identity. So as we give a nod to the notion of Trinity, this Trinity Sunday 2022, I want to encourage you to be grateful that our Christian forebears resisted the urge to limit their description of God to that which could be easily understood or neatly conceptualized. The richness and paradoxical nature of the Trinity, I think, continues to open new doors to fresh avenues of inquiry, both into the nature of God and into the nature of the humanity that we are created in as the divine image. Like the Trinity, each of us is also a mystery that will equally reward any ongoing exploration. So here's to the creative and revealing dynamic of this mystery. Happy Holy Trinity Sunday.